Alright guys, here goes nothing. Well, there you have it. I gotta say that looks freaking awesome. Absolutely awesome. So that now we have a lid. Hopefully you can see that is perfectly sized to the box. So all that's left to do is to go ahead and mortise these hinges down into the sides of the box. Typically when I do these boxes, I will forego mortising the hinges into the lid because you're dealing with veneer and sometimes the veneer can chip out, it can get a little wonky, and or you can by the nature of the thickness of the leaf have to route past the veneer into the plywood, and you just don't want any of that visible. So what we will do probably is route the entire thickness of the hinge down into the box itself and still end up with a no gap, or an appropriate gap, which for a box is typically, not very much back here, maybe a playing card or two, and then obviously nothing in the front. But I am loving how that's coming together. It's sitting nice and flush across the front. Once we get this thing sanded up and rounded over, and again, now remember, even though this is veneer, because we have solid stock on all four sides, we can actually introduce a nice round over or a chamfer or whatever sort of edge detail we want. Just obviously being careful that you're not going to go past your edge banding. And now that I'm saying that, I'm realizing that's another reason why I don't use mitered edge banding like I did in this case. It turned out pretty good. It's a little off, and honestly now, because I mitered it, I'm going to have exposed end grain in the front of the box, which I wouldn't have had that had I just done the butt joint like I typically do. The other issue is then by looking at the back of the box or the side, which is usually where the end grain comes out, which would match the dovetails, right? You'd have end grain sticking out on the lid, so that would have matched. It would have looked cool. I guess we have it on the front too, so it looks all right. But my point being, that would give you a guide for how far back your edge detail could go. If the exposed end grain over here represented the thickness of your edge banding, you would know, hey, I could run a chamfer, 3/16 of an inch back without risking running into the plywood or the substrate or whatever you're using underneath. So I would recommend, after using the mitered edge banding for the first time, to not do that. It just, it's not worth it. Okay, so I've got the lid all sanded up. I'll walk you through briefly what I did here. I started with 120 using my random orbit sander. 120, 150, 220 to 320. Be very careful if you're using redwood. This is redwood. Redwood is a very soft wood, so it's very easy to sand through the veneer if you're not careful. So with the 120 grit, I might have done 5 passes. As I progressively got to the lighter grits, you can go for a little longer without fear of sanding through. Obviously 320, it would take you quite a while to sand through with 320. You'll know, rub your hand across the surface, and if it's uniformly smooth in all the areas, you're finished. At that point, I got my hand sanding blocks. I make these just with 3/4 inch MDF, some foam pad, and some of the PSA sandpaper on the back. So I started again with 120, went to 220, 320 on the edge banding, being careful to eliminate any sort of blemishes, any sort of holes or chips or anything like that. You want to sand through those because the oil is going to highlight those and they're going to stick out. So once I did the edge banding, then it was time to work on the transitions, and that's where the veneer kind of rolls over into the edge banding. For that, you can go ahead and start with 220 because you really don't need a whole lot to make that edge an eased edge, as they call it. So I just went with 220 to get the shape, and then I finished up with 320. And honestly, this stuff is so soft, you could probably shape it with 320. I paid close attention to the corners too. In a lot of cases, you want to wrap the sandpaper around the corners to make sure that if you have any end grain here, that stuff gets polished and isn't drinking up the oil when we go to apply it. And you also want to pay close attention to ease the outermost edges of those corners, again being careful not to take too much off. You just want a uniform easement of the edge on all sides. Once you think you're there, and I believe I'm there, it's time to put the oil on. So without further ado, I will get my pyramids out and get my oil out, and we'll give it a whirl here. I am really excited about this. As I had said earlier in this series, I've never worked with redwood before. I got some redwood on eBay from a guy, crazy deal. I think I got like 20 board feet of it for $50 shipped. I'm not sure if it was probably old decking, old reclaimed stuff or what, but it was an awesome deal. It was all quarter sawn, all old growth, all curly. And so I've just been sitting on it because it's an endangered species, or at least I think it's on the red list. So you're not supposed to cut any more down, which means there's a limited supply on the market. And I live in the East Coast, so it's not readily available out here unless you're willing to pay a lot of money for it. So I've been sitting on it for a couple years, never had a project to use it on, and this seemed like a perfect project. I just used a tiny little bit of it for the solid edge banding, and then of course I got this redwood stump veneer from certainlywood.com. Anyway, here it goes. That's awesome. Now Now this stuff seems like it's pretty thirsty, so I'm not gonna be timid here. I'm gonna really soak this thing, at least on the first pass. As I said, this is my homemade varnish. I do not do the typical 2 applications that you would with like a boiled linseed oil, where you flood the surface and come back and flood the surface again. I do 1 application, so I'm going to flood the surface a fair amount the first time, let it drink it in, hit any dry spots that appear a couple times, and then let it dry. But I have got to say, this is really looking beautiful. The curly figures popping out, and I mean that's only going to get better with the polyurethane on top of there. That'll really add to the chatoyance, as they call it. That is awesome. And now you get to see what I was talking about in the beginning of the series, how the solid wood itself was actually curly. So it sort of matches. You got the curl coming off the front edge. I think it's the front edge, well, it's the back edge, but still you got the curl coming off the back edge, and you can see in the light there that is curl on the solid wood. So it almost matches. I was afraid maybe that it would look kind of silly with straight grain on the sides, but it looks, for all intents and purposes, like a solid piece of, like a solid redwood slab. So it was effective. Again, we've got end grain out here. Not a big deal. It's going to look awesome. So I am going to feed it a little bit more oil here, because I can see it's drying up pretty fast. And this stuff is so soft, man. I really, really want to protect this. Typically my box lids are made with harder woods, bubingas, mahogany. Mahogany's not really a hard wood, but sapelli, those are all harder than oak, or up there in the oak range. So this stuff is, I believe, on the Janka hardness scale, something like, I mean, I want to say 300, 400, not very much. So very fragile, but I think that looks awesome. I'm going to go ahead and let that dry, and I will see you back here when we cut the mortises in the box. Welcome back. The box is dry, the lid is dry, and so now I'm going to go ahead and mortise the lid hinges. As I had said in the last video, we are not going to mortise into the lid itself. We're going to mortise the full thickness of the hinges down into the box, and that's just how I do these. You're welcome to do it a different way, but I like doing that because the lid is veneered. So what I did was I put the appropriate hinge back on the box, put screws in there, and then I took my marking knife and just real gently, now I have a single bevel marking knife, and that's important for this because when I draw it with the bevel away from the edge that I'm trying to trace, the bevel will actually push the blade into the surface I'm trying to trace, and so you have less risk of going off your line. And also, I mean, if you try to send a dual bevel blade down there, you're going to end up with a kind of a big valley, and you don't want that. You just want the outline. So I've done that. I'll go ahead and pull these screws back out without hitting the camera, hopefully. There's one. And there's two. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. There's a nice little knife outline. So I will proceed to the next one, do the same thing over here, and then we will work on the depth, which is pretty simple. Stop hitting the camera. Alrighty. Just dump all this crap out here. There's a nice short one. I'm going to make sure that the leaf itself does not move on you. After all, we are going to be tracing it with a knife. So I'm just going to take my knife and draw it back. It's a lot like marking the dovetails. Now when I go with the grain, I'm going to be very careful. I'm going to go slowly. I'm going to raise the knife up and just use the tip. Just put the tip in. And what that's going to allow you to do is avoid, as much as you can, following the grain of the wood rather than outlining the hinge, which is what we're trying to do here. Okay, now I just got done explaining that this is a single bevel, so this is a flat side. This side is beveled. This is a custom knife. I made it out of a bandsaw blade, but many marking knives are this way. So now, rather than come over here where I have the bevel facing the hinge, I don't want that. I'm going to turn it around and come in from this direction very carefully. Again, using just the tip so that I have more control. What I don't want is that. I don't want to come flying past my mark. And it seems that as much as I wanted to avoid doing it, I did it. So you guys get to see firsthand what that looks like. And that little cut mark that's gone past the line is the result of me doing what I said I was trying to avoid. So, a teaching moment. Okay, now we can go ahead and pull the screws out. And I don't use the actual screws. I have a bunch of these tiny little brass screws because I have a bunch of these tiny little hinges. I just use the shortest screws possible because this isn't the final installation. I just needed them to stay put in the final position so that I could get them marked. Now that we have them marked, what I'm going to do is go and get my, there's a couple ways you can do this, but I think what I'm going to do is I have a nice little miniature router plane, and I'm going to grab that real quick. If I can find it. Well, there it is. All right. So I have this little guy, and this I got on eBay from a tool maker. I think they're in Canada, St. James Bay Tool Company. This is all cast bronze. Anyway, same sort of deal as any other version. It's just a smaller version. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen the blade. This one does not have all the cool features of the larger models. Kind of a bare bones sort of tool. I'm going to take the hinge, put the barrel, let me see what you guys see. There you go. I'm going to put the barrel right here. I'm going to drop the cutter until it is just ever so slightly below the barrel of the hinge. And that's right about there. That's perfect. And now I'm going to tighten the blade. If you don't have one of these, not a big deal. You can use a marking gauge the same sort of way. Set the marking gauge, turn it down and mark your depth. Or you can use a combination square, set your depth. And so in this instance, I would set my depth right about there. And now hold this down and take my marking knife and mark underneath. So there's a whole bunch of different ways you do it, or that you can do it. This is the way I do it because I have this tool, but I've done it all those other ways as well. So now I'm going to I'm going to come in, and using the corner of the cutter, I am going to score a line across the back. It pretty much connects the two outside marks of the hinge. And that is pretty much what you're left with. Something like that. Okay. So that's it. We pretty much have the outline now of our hinge. I will quickly slide over here and do the other one. And the reason we're doing this is the reason that we mark dovetails out. It's the reason that we mark out any kind of mortise, is that now we have our extremes, we have our outer limits of the mortise marked in cut lines, which will allow us, when we get to those points with the chisel, to stick the chisel right in there and be sure that we end up at the same spot. So at this point, let's see if I can do this without ruining my camera. All right, I'm going to pause real quick, get you guys set up on a different stand, and see you back here in a minute. Okay, welcome back. I got you guys in a different spot now. Should be more advantageous for both of us. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come in with my chisel, starting within the framework of my outline, and just take a couple light taps. Move my chisel forward about 1/16 of an inch or so, and just keep moving forward, making sure that I'm not going too far past the foremost knife line that marks the outer edge of the hinge leaf. Leave yourself plenty of room. Okay, so now we've made mincemeat of the top layer of material there. I'm going to bring my chisel in level with the top of the box very carefully. You do not want to push very hard. You're basically just wiggling the chisel forward and popping out any of the loose debris. If you try to bear down and push on it, you will most certainly slip and end up pushing out the back. Okay, so now that's where we're at after that little maneuver. So now I'm going to outline the back. So we have clearance now. I can get my chisel in there and come down. Slide it over. Come down. And now I can push, wiggling forward a little bit, and pop that back piece out. Same thing there. So now we are left with the outermost edges. So I take my chisel against the far left and right knife cuts at this point, and just a gentle chop. Boom. And you're just defining that cut now. You're pushing it down a little further than the knife line did. Okay. And now you can either continue with that method, using the chisel to chop out little layer by layer, or you can come in with your little router plane here, and this thing can be kind of more fidgety than it's worth sometimes. is nice because it sets a consistent depth all along the bottom of the mortise. And now each time that you go down a level, you want to further define the edges of the mortise. Now, when you are further defining the back edge of the mortise, be very careful not to hammer down too hard, because it is very easy on a 1/2 inch piece, and sometimes I do this on less than 1/2 inch pieces, to basically split the board. This is a wedge after all. And by hammering this down in the grain like this, you are essentially, the board wants to force apart, and you will split this out or pop a piece off the back. So just be very careful. You don't have to really be quite as careful when you're going across the grain, because there isn't the tendency to split across the grain. So you know what, sometimes it's just easier to use your chisel. If that little router plane had sort of a micro adjust feature, it would be a lot more handy, but it does not. So I usually find it easier to just excavate using the chisel, and then on your very last pass, get the depth set with the router plane, and just make sure that the depths between the two mortises are the same using the router plane. And we are keeping a close eye on our depth mark that we made. And so we are almost chopped down, it looks like, to around that portion. One more good whack should get us down to depth. Yep, that's it. Okay. Okay, and so what I did there, since I had that stuff loosened up, I went ahead and put my chisel right into the depth cut line, and keeping it as level as possible, just slid it forward. And because you have kind of notched out all that waste in there, it should pop out pretty easily. All right. And that is absolutely perfect. That is a perfect size, perfect depth, perfect everything. So again, I am going to drop the cutter down. Actually, these are a little fidgety because when you tighten them down, they drop a little further. So I'm going to sit here and play with it until I get what I feel is the right depth. Okay, there it is. stray bits are out of the way. Because these are real thin brass hinges, and if you have any kind of chunks or bits down in there, when you go to seat them, you put the screw in, they will bend and flex very easily. All right, so we have one done. The other one's done the same way. I'm going to turn the camera off so you guys have seen this. You know how it's done. I'm going to hurry up, get this one done, throw the hinges on, and see how the box looks. I'll turn it back on. Okay, the hinge mortises are complete. It is now time to go ahead and I want to install the hinges. You don't have to do this. Honestly, you can finish the piece first. So what I plan on doing with this one is doing either probably just a single coat of armor seal on the box, because we already put my homemade varnish on. It's got some armor seal in it. It's got some tung oil in it. So probably just a top coat of armor seal satin, and then the same thing on this guy. So you could wait to install the hinges after that point. Probably would be wiser. I want to get a feel for how it's going to look, if the lid is going to set the right height, and then obviously if I'm happy with it, I'll have to take the hinges back off again. So that's why I say, if you want to skip this step and just go ahead on and finish it, be my guest. But I'm going to go ahead. I kind of want to see what it looks like. So bear with me. Okay. Now, be forewarned. In fact, I'm actually going to do that. Remember when we were drilling the holes, the pilot holes for the screws, we didn't go down really that far, and now we took out about maybe 3/16 of an inch of wood. So those holes just got 3/16 of an inch more shallow. And some of these screws are longer than others. So for that reason, I'm just going to deepen the pilot holes a little bit here. Again, you run no risk of blowing through anything when you're dealing with these. You can go as deep as you want. See, what you don't want to have happen is the pilot hole be too shallow, and I've had this happen more times than I can count on one hand. When you're going to screw these tiny little baby screws down, it bottoms out, and these are brass screws. These are not meant for pushing their way through wood fibers, especially not white oak wood fibers. And so what will happen is you will either strip the screw head out, or you will shear the screw off, and you're stuck at that point. It's the screw shank stuck in there. There's no way to get it out without butchering the whole side. It can ruin the whole project. So I'm a little more careful now. The other thing that I tend to do is put a little wax on the screw head. Not a lot. I just draw it past a little block of wax. Just hit a little dot there. That's all you really need on there. That is going to help it glide effortlessly into this white oak. Be mindful of your torque settings. I always set my torque to the smallest possible torque setting when I'm dealing with these little screws. Now the only downside of using screw wax is it will push up out of the screw hole and kind of gum up your hinge. So it's best not to do the screw wax on the final application. You want to do your screw wax on at least the second to final application, because you'll want to take them back out, polish the hinges up, and at that point the wax is already down in the hole. The screw threads are kind of coated with the wax, so when you take the screw out and put it back again, you're going to be fine. And see, that's what I mean, if you can get a good look at that. But the screw wax will tend to pop up out of the screw hole and kind of gum up the hinge. Not a big deal. It's better to have safely installed those screws than to risk a broken screw and just have to polish off a little bit of that beeswax. And I had told you guys this was a candle. This is actually beeswax mixed with, I think I mixed it with coconut oil, melted it down, and then let it solidify. And so what you end up with is a much softer much softer wax than it would if it would just be pure beeswax, which is, among other things, less expensive to use. Now, I don't bother waxing these because this is just plywood. It is much kinder on the threads of these little screws. Okay, so I could go ahead and put those. In fact, you know what? What the heck? I'm just going to put the other screws in. Believe it or not, it does affect the final placement of the hinge. That last screw can kind of pull it or push it in one direction or another. And so I have learned the hard way by not putting that fourth screw in. If I make any adjustments, or say I put the front clasp on, and then I've come to find out that by installing the fourth screw, it shifted a little bit. So that is it. So on first appearance, it looks like it's getting hung up somewhere, and I think I see where that is. So the hinges are actually hitting the inside, the far sides here. So what I'm going to have to do is just expand the hole. You guys can't see this, but what's happening here is this top hinge is coming down and impacting the side of this mortise here. And what that tells me is that the hinge is not quite square. It's off ever so slightly. And that's fine. I just got to widen the mortise by a 64th of an inch. Not very much at all. But anyway, that, you can see where it's making contact. And so that is going to be perfect. So ultimately, that's what it's going to look like. That is a perfect lid gap for a box in my book. I could even maybe go down a little more than that, but I like it. I'm going to be happy with it. As soon as I expand those hinge mortises for the other leaf, this thing's going to be golden. And then we will go ahead and find a brass clasp for the front of it and put some finish on it, and we'll be finished. All right, I'll see you then. Hey guys, welcome back. Okay, so I fixed the hinges. Now what we're going to do is we're going to install a latch. This is a brass latch for small boxes that I had. I have a bunch of these. I have a bunch of hinges that kind of match them. So I just pulled this one out of my stock. How I go about this, you want to take the front of the box, I measure it. I got lucky here. This is 8.5 inches. So I put a pencil mark at 4.5 inches on both the lid and the box. I then start with the top portion, center it right over top of that pencil mark, and then I also center it top to bottom. As you can see, we have a little bit of play in the thickness. So I'm going to set it centered left to right and centered top to bottom. And then I put a little divot right in the center of that screw hole. I removed it, drilled that out with my 1/16 inch drill bit. Now I put it back up. I get a screw ready. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and use a hand screwdriver for this. And I am going to try to get this started. Okay, now that is tight. Now what that allows me to do is swivel this thing over so that it matches. And you can see right there, we've got a pretty good match. And by match, I'm referring to the space here as opposed to the space on the bottom. We don't want it cockeyed or crooked, we want it straight. And so that looks pretty straight. So once you're happy with that, you make a little mark, trying to get it as close to the center of that screw hole as possible. Sometimes you can come back in and kind of pull it or rotate it up to get that closer to center. And I think that's it. Once you have that done, loosen the other screw, swivel that out of the way, drill this hole, grab another screw and install that. And that will give us the top of the latch. So we're already halfway done here. And I'm going to tighten both of those down. And that's fairly straight. It got a little wonky, but I'm happy with it. Okay, now this part can be a little tricky. So, as you can see, the hook has a curve in it. And that is important because the distance from the two pieces when it's down in the curve is different than the distance when it is here. So we wouldn't want to put it anywhere but closed, and you kind of want to pull the lid shut. I like to put a fair amount of pressure on it. And now what I'm watching, these two pieces are the same length. So I'm pulling down and I'm looking that the two pieces here are in line with each other vertically. And I don't ever really use a square, but I suppose that you could use a square like that. And now sneak a little mark into the center of that screw hole. Now you can let go, flip that out of the way, and we're basically at this point just going to repeat the process. Obviously, on this one, being careful that you don't drill through the back, because that would not be good. Wouldn't be the end of the world. It's inside the box. You might not see it, especially if you want to put a liner in there. But if we're not intending to do it, I'd rather not do it. Okay, that looks to be about good. And now, same deal here. I'm going to put the screw on the screwdriver and go ahead and get that down in there. Shoot. Be careful not to do that. This is a little more difficult to get the screw sunk down into that white oak. And now at this point, all you got to do, you don't really have to fidget with this part anymore. That's done. Now you just have to line this up. Honestly, you can do that any number of ways. I am going to try this just to see if this is good, and that looks to have been an effective way, and that looks pretty even up there. So I'll go ahead and throw a mark Again, the important part is to try to get that divot right in the center of that screw hole, because if it's off even by a micron, it's going to lend itself to being crooked. So I found my divot. I am going to deepen it a little bit, give myself a better chance of not jumping out of it, and then go ahead and drill for the next hole. Now you're welcome to use screw wax for the white oak. In fact, I think I will, since that first one was a little temperamental. And I'm sure what happened is I hit a portion of the white oak, as I was trying to explain earlier, that was not completely drilled out. So trying to push a tiny brass screw through white oak wood fibers is next to impossible without damaging the screw head or the box when you jump out. But I think I can sand that down. Might not ever see it. Okay, so there it is. Our latch is installed. Our hinges are installed. This looks a little rough right now because there was like a black stain, I think, from some grain filler I used. So I just took a card scraper to that, scraped it off, and put some oil back on there. But we are almost done. I mean, the construction's done, the hardware's done. I think it looks awesome. I think as like a gift, somebody would be happy to have that. Hand-cut dovetails, veneered redwood lid, redwood stump, curly redwood stump lid. That's pretty cool. So that's it. I am going to now take all the hardware back off and go ahead and prep everything for a final coat of General Finishes Armor Seal. I'll turn you back on then.